welcome to the podcast. My name is Reginald Bears, and as you know from last episode, I'm a stand-up comedian, but more importantly, a concerned citizen. Joined, as always, by my co-host, Sid Singh. Introduce yourself.
Hey, thanks for having me, everyone. I am a comedian, and I am still an unlicensed attorney, so last week was fun. Let's keep doing this.
And before we go on, I should probably just note that there's going to be a bit of a tonal difference between last episode and this episode. In the last episode, we were a bit more buttoned down, like we were presenting a lecture, and in this one, we're going to try to be more conversational. We don't want you to have to feel like you're working to learn something. We just want to be able to give you an engaging conversation that you walk away from with more information. Hopefully, as the show gets bigger, we'll be able to expand the team and try to offload some of the other tasks so we can really focus on giving you the best episode possible. That being said, if you'd like to help out, we have a donation link in the description. You can donate. That'll help with the production costs, equipment, hosting fees, etc. Basically, the show is free for everybody except us. It is all coming out of pocket, and it's hard. So if you'd like to help out, we'd really appreciate it. If you don't want to, we hope you enjoy the show and maybe just share it with somebody you know. Anyway, let's get into it. Trump signed an executive order that claims that sexual identity of transgender service members, the direct quote is, conflicts with a soldier's commitment to an honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle, even in one's personal life, end quote, and is harmful to military readiness. Afterwards, in response to the orders, Hegseth, the defense secretary, or the secretary of defense, issued a policy that presumptively disqualifies people with gender dysphoria from military service. And then on February 11th, it was set up that it's no longer allowing transgender individuals to join the military and would stop performing or facilitating procedures associated with gender transition for service members. Later the month, military said that it would also begin expelling transgender members, and a judge has at least temporarily blocked it with an executive order stating that it violates soldiers' constitutional rights. But the Trump administration is appealing this injunction and asking to move forward with the ban anyway. Sid, is that close to correct?
Yeah. I mean, that sounds about... It sounds about right to me. Yeah. It's always awkward when something so abhorrent happens and you have to be, yes, that is correct in terms of that is what has happened. But as you'll find out in this episode, I think it's terrible. It really kind of comes down to what are the effects, right? Thousands of transgender people serve in the military, but they really only represent 1% of the total number of active duty service members. So, one of the things we wanted to talk about today was what are the effects of revoking enlistments of career service members? How does that affect their pensions, their health care? Is it a dishonorable discharge, or is their participation annulled? But as you'll see, one of the most frustrating parts is the reality of the answer. They probably have no idea at all because they don't really put a lot of thought into the after effects. That's for the lawsuits to figure out. Essentially, the plaintiffs who sued to block Trump's order include an Army Reserve platoon leader from Pennsylvania, an Army major who was awarded a Bronze Star for service in Afghanistan, and a Sailor of the Year award-winning a member of the Navy. These are real people who deserve their pensions.
Yeah, but I will say this, because you say that they're not thinking too much about what the consequences are. They're just, and that's kind of by design. It's not even we'll figure it out later. It is truly, the whole strategy has been to flood the zone and just inundate people with so many executive orders, so many things, cause chaos, just start tearing things apart, ripping up the wiring, and then now you, the opposition party, in theory, not as much in practice as we would hope, have to now scramble to try to fix everything. I think that it's important that we note this isn't they didn't even think this through. This is they don't care. They don't care about the effects.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons we picked this as sort of our second episode is because it's kind of a reminder that a lot of this stuff have actually happened before. In 2016, under the Obama administration, a Defense Department policy permitted transgender people to serve openly in the military. They were basically allowed to be who they were in order to serve our country to the best of their ability. And of course, even back then, during Trump's first term in the White House, the Republicans issued a directive to ban transgender service members. And essentially, what the Supreme Court did back then was to say that the military was allowed to no longer permit transgender members to join. However, the transgender members of the military currently were allowed to stay members of the military. So they weren't allowed to fire anyone, but they were allowed to stop hiring people. And this is a thing that Joe Biden, a Democrat, scrapped when he took office. So this sort of case is about, can the Trump administration go a step further? Can they now fire all of the service members who are trans just for being who they are?
Which it seems to me that that would be like a direct, because we have so many laws about anti-discrimination and saying you cannot hire or fire somebody based on their identity. And I guess Trump's executive orders are also saying the only genders that America recognizes are male and female, and
Right.
saying it's a binary, then that is no longer a protective class of citizen, and that's why they're saying that they have the right to discriminate against them. Is that, I guess, their take?
Yeah, that seems to be their take right now, is they are treating it as an illness and arguing that essentially they don't let people who are mentally ill join the military, and therefore if we believe these people are mentally ill, then they don't get to join either.
Here's the thing, and this is, I think, just as a side note for myself, this is such a conflict of interest for me, because on one hand, I'm like, so sick, so based, don't join the military. But, like, they shouldn't be allowed to not do it, even though I'm like, hell yeah. Like, if you said, hey, anybody named Reginald no longer allowed to be in the military, I'd be like, sir, that is uncalled for. I will not push back, though. And, like, you know, it's obviously a different thing for the people who are already there. They've been building up pensions. They've been building up, VA benefits. Like, what happens to all these things if you're 5, 6, 10 years into your career and now it's like, never mind. And it's like, no, that's not never mind, you know?
Well, and it also it goes a step further, right? Because it effectively asks the question: who is allowed to serve America, and in what capacity, right? And especially this idea that, I don't think they have any real plans of how the pensions will be handled. You sort of look into, well, right now the policy is that only people that they believe to be mentally well are allowed to serve, right? Which on its face, you go, yeah, of course, because me and you don't think of being trans as a mental illness. But if they can expand the definition to whatever they want, then why wouldn't other members of the LGBTQIA community be next? And after that, why wouldn't race be next? These people are not doing these things to make America safer. They are doing things to win political points back to their constituents, all right? And if their constituents are racist, if they are sexist, if they are homophobic, these things are going to be next.
And it is, especially when you say that they're not doing this to make America safe, they're doing it to win political points. What's also, look, I don't agree with the political points they're trying to make anyway, so it's frustrating no matter what. But, like, additionally frustrating is that they're trying to win political points that contradict each other. Yes. Like, their whole statement right now is we have to increase the lethality of the U.S. military, as if the lethality of the U.S. military has ever been an issue. Like, it is the most well-funded military in history. And I'm like, not quite lethal enough, but you know what would make it more lethal? If we don't allow as many people to be soldiers. And it's like, what are you doing? If I don't need the military to be bigger. I don't want people to be in the military, but, like, you're supposed to be allowed to be in the military. And if you are supposed to be doing that, like, leave my own personal feelings aside. You're not increasing lethality by removing swaths of, in some cases, very decorated career service members.
Yeah, I mean, it's especially rich coming from the kinds of people, if you want to know when we're recording this episode, it's 2 days after this big Signal stories broke, where Pete Hegseth, the guy who was behind this ban, basically revealed operational secrets to a journalist who just happened to be in his Signal group chat.
The fact that Pete Hegseth is even the Secretary of Defense in the first place shows so much of that it's not about a principled stance. The quote was, "It conflicts with the soldier's commitment to an honorable, truthful, disciplined lifestyle, even in one's personal life." And truly, it cannot be overstated that Pete Hegseth was appointed to be the Secretary of Defense, the head of this organization, when he has so many allegations against him for various things. And all of them are things that are not honorable or disciplined. He has multiple instances of sexual assault levied against him. Two instances in one night that happened in 2017 that I'm just going to talk about because they seem pretty damning, even though he wasn't officially charged for them. The accuser said that they were in a room in a hotel and he took her phone and blocked the door, and that she believed she was drugged. Also, the accuser subsequently went to the hospital to get a rape kit taken, which is what you would expect from a person who's not just making it up months later to ruin a man's reputation in the Me Too era as an opportunistic opportunity. Ultimately, there was a settlement for that case where the settlement was for $50,000 and required her to sign an NDA, which is not, look, we don't know what happened. That is not indicative of a man who has no culpability in that instance. And things can be blurry, but like, why are we giving this man the benefit of the doubt when his own mother doesn't give him the benefit of the doubt? And there's an old email that surfaced right before he was appointed where she said, Pete, I quote, "You are an abuser of women. That is an ugly truth, and I have no respect for any man that belittles, lies, cheats, and sleeps around and uses women for his own power and ego. You are that man and have been for years, and as your mother, it pains me and embarrasses me to say it, but it is the sad, sad truth." That's not a lefty liberal journalist who's trying to slam you. That's his own mother saying that. And like, look, also, he has not got comparable leadership experience to be the Secretary of Defense, and he's an alcoholic with former Fox employees, former and current Fox employees, saying that he would sometimes, often show up early, smelling like booze, without any sleep or barely any sleep before being rushed onto air. He also was at the head of the Vets for Freedom organization. When he was leading that, he ended up accruing hundreds of thousands of dollars of unpaid bills, which led to an internal campaign, to have him ousted, and then he was eventually removed from his leadership position. None of this is indicative of a person who is honorable and disciplined, and you're going to say that these decorated career service members who happen to be trans are somehow less disciplined than this person who is a walking embodiment of a fail son.
Yeah,
that's all I have to say on him.
but it's an important point to make, because I think over and over again, I don't think normally we would try to levy this level of scrutiny onto any one government employee. But the point is that this is what they are trying to do to people who don't have a lot of power. It's important, and it is now suddenly relevant how the people who do have power are so much worse than the people they seek to demonize.
Yeah, and I think it's also one reason that we typically wouldn't put so much scrutiny on one individual person, because it's not about the person, it's about the overall movement. And ultimately, whenever we say, well, this is all flawed because of what Pete Hegseth did, it reduces the argument to, well, if Pete Hegseth were gone, it would change anything about the situation, and it wouldn't. This is just an example of this same administration in a very, very, very close time frame, who they deem as dignified, honorable, and disciplined, and who they deem as ill people to be discarded. Well, which also is not how we're supposed to deal with ill people.
One of the most insidious accusations people have against trans people is that they are dangerous to be around women, right? And that's why all these insane bathroom bills get. But you know who's dangerous to be around women? Pete Hegseth. So the idea that we have to pretend that someone who had actual allegations is somehow less dangerous than people with no allegations and a ton of military medals is insane. Especially, I mean, you know, the sort of liberal political arguments against this, which I think used to be quite conservative, if you'd argue me, is just that it's like, at the end of the day, transgender troops seek nothing more than the opportunity to continue dedicating their lives to defending the nation. People who are qualified for the job, who have already had the job, should be allowed to do the job without government interference. That sounds like something Ronald Reagan would have said. And I don't even like Ronald Reagan, but if you're conservative, he would not be on your side.
Getting back to the topic at hand, I'll say this. I know that Trump has signed, hundreds of executive orders so far. I remember on day 2 of the presidency, I was trying to explain to one of our British friends some of the things that Trump was doing. And I was like, let me just summarize some of these bullet points. So I looked at a website that had them all, and I was summarizing some bullet points. I gave him 8, and then I scrolled down and I realized there were already 90 different bullet points that were all that were all pretty in depth and are all pretty awful and pretty devastating and kind of overreaches and things that would also probably the court would need to consider them. And it is. I was like, okay, this is so much. And that was 2 days in, and he's continued to sign things. And I guess one of the big questions I have, or because I'll be honest, I don't know all that much about an executive order. This is last 2 months has been a crash course for me on going back, like in a way that you're like, oh, I've had to like go back to law school with all the research. How do I research all this case law again? I've been doing that same thing with basic civics because Trump does something and I'm like, what is that? What's an executive order?
Right.
Because and especially when it's being framed by because we've talked also about how the media is very much on Trump's side and they just are saying whatever they need to say to kind of not rock the boat and not gain his ire, so to speak. They also word it the same way he is, which is now I've signed this executive order. Now this is what America does. This is how it is now. And is that really the case?
So it really comes down to, the founding document, which is the Constitution. And in Article 2 of the United States Constitution, it vests the president with executive power over the government, including the obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. An executive order is essentially a written directive signed by the president that orders the government to take specific actions to ensure the laws be faithfully executed. Now, often what ends up happening is that laws can be vaguer than intended, and it kind of is up to the president to interpret those laws for how they feel like executing them is a sort of a thing. So, for example, certain drugs might be illegal, but the executive order can be to say that people who sell marijuana are no longer a priority when we're trying to execute the laws. And essentially, the way they work, though, is that ultimately they can't override federal laws and statutes, and it can be struck down either by Congress passing a law or by a judge striking down its constitutionality. So, for example, if an executive action tries to go further than just interpreting how a law is executed, but in fact reinterpreting that law altogether as to make it null and void, then a court will often, step in to strike it down. And also, you see this a lot when it goes from Democrat to Republican or vice versa. A new president will often just remove executive orders. So, for example, in 2021, Biden came into office and he immediately got rid of Trump's original executive order to do this to trans people.
Well, I know that the judges do have a right in the function and the job responsibility to strike something down, but like what is striking it down consist of? Because especially in a situation where Trump and Vance have said very publicly, they don't have the right to do that, despite the fact that that is their explicit function in the government.
Right. So let's put it like this way, right? If let's say this executive order has just been issued, someone has to sue and they have to have standing and they have to generally start at the district court level. Basically, the Supreme Court is so busy, it's extremely rare for them to be like, no, we're going to take this immediately. However, if the Supreme Court has decided that actually this executive order is unconstitutional, then they are allowed to strike it down, at which point the executive branch is no longer allowed to try to pursue this order in any capacity. However, if it's
they can't amend it.
Yeah, they can issue a new executive order that they feel is now in line with what the Supreme Court has said. So it's not like they can't touch that subject matter again. They just have to basically do it in a way that is constitutional. However,
if a fully new executive order.
Exactly. And if a lower court, so something lower than the Supreme Court, however, strikes it down, then the executive branch is allowed to appeal. And they can appeal it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And generally what ends up happening is while the appeals process is happening, typically one of the sides will file an attempted injunction with the judge to basically say that while this case is under review, we feel that this order should or should not come to pass. So, for example, let's say a district court struck down this ban and the government appealed, then the Circuit Court of Appeals would have to decide while their appeal is being heard if this ban would be allowed to come to pass or not. And often what that means is, would it be materially disruptive if this ban that might be unconstitutional is in effect while we decide that? So for the case of this, I think it'd be very messed up for a judge to not file an injunction, and basically that transgender people are allowed to get fired if in 2 weeks they would suddenly have to be rehired, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay, how would Theo Vaughn say this? Oh,
at the end of the day, what is the government's actual legal argument for this? And the government's lawyers are arguing that the military officials have broad discretion to decide how to assign and deploy service members without judicial interference. Because essentially the president gets to grant him and his military leaders all the authority they need to defend our borders. This is something we talked about last week. And as a result, courts tend to give them wide discretion when it comes to the military. But there's actually something more insidious here, which is that the government is asserting that the injuries that the plaintiffs are claiming happened are actually really vague. They're basically saying that once the plaintiffs are fired for being trans, the plaintiffs are arguing that that's kind of a huge stigma to put against them. And it's going to make them much harder for them to get a second job, especially when they haven't done anything wrong. But it's even crazier than that, right? Because the government's actually arguing that they don't believe that. They're like, the stigma against being trans is not a big deal, which is, again, crazy when they're the ones creating the stigma and making it a big deal.
Yeah. And also, especially if it becomes a dishonorable discharge, that's a thing where even if you had no additional stigmas, a dishonorable discharge makes a lot of things harder for you in the future. So, yeah. And you're saying, I think it's such a big deal you can't be here, but actually it's not that big a deal. Get over it.
And again, it's one of those things where it's like, it's one thing to say that. It's another thing to say that when you're the one specifically making it a big deal.
Yeah.
You're literally saying they are not fit to serve in our military. And this kind of comes down to what the plaintiff's legal arguments are, right? Because essentially, the plaintiff's attorneys are contending that Trump's order violates trans people's rights to equal protection under the Fifth Amendment. And if you want to know what the equal protection of the Fifth Amendment is, it basically just states that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. And the Supreme Court has ruled that the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment contains a prohibition against vague laws that an implied equal protection requirement for the federal government's actions allows. So just a really quick update, since this actually already has gone to a district court judge. The latest news is that a district court judge has temporarily sided with the plaintiffs, with the pro-trans side, and yet, unfortunately, the government is expected to appeal. However, we kind of know that the reason the government is appealing is because this isn't a legal issue. It's a political one. So, Reginald, what would you say, what are the politics takeaways of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, the question is that they're trying to posit is whether or not trans people are real, whether or not that transgender, quote unquote, transgender ideology, which is their way. It's the same way they say DEI instead of saying diversity, equity, inclusion. They're trying to abstract away from the actual words that they're saying, not saying transgender people, transgender ideology, because I'm not being a bigot if I'm fighting an ideology. I mean, they would also they're positing that it's a medical condition. They're medicalizing it as this is a mental disorder that makes them unqualified for it. But gender dysphoria is not. So first off, important to say that I am not trans. I do not speak for trans people, and I apologize for my blind spots. But basically, I think it's important to just first look at what gender dysphoria is. Mayo Clinic says that gender dysphoria is a feeling of distress that can happen when a person's gender identity differs from the sex they are assigned at birth. So it's not a disorder. It's a set of diagnostic criteria that reflects psychological distress. And it's also important to keep in mind that gender nonconformity is not inherently the same as gender dysphoria, nor do all trans and non-binary people suffer from the distress that is defined as gender dysphoria. That said, there is a high comorbidity between gender dysphoria and other mental health conditions, depression, suicidality, etc. And that is often what I think people try to link toward to say, oh, this is a mental illness because it's closely linked with all these other mental illnesses as well. And I am not a doctor, but that does not seem to be, from my research and from perspectives of people talking about it, does not seem to be the case. And it's also important to keep in mind, if I didn't already say this, that a lot of people, or many people who do have gender dysphoria, do not view it as a disorder for themselves either. It is just like, hey, this is what it is, and if I can find ways to reaffirm my gender, then it's less of a problem. And I think it's also important to keep in mind when we look at this of like, there's a lot of suicidality and there's a lot of depression within these people who have gender dysphoria. And it's like, well, yeah, you're saying there's a lot of depression and suicidality in a group of people who are experiencing significant medicalized distress. And yeah, it kind of makes sense when you think about it. In the same way as when you're looking at people who are being tortured, there's a high rate of people not being happy afterwards,
And I think it also, I think it also is just, we have to put this in context of like there's a lot of depressions and suicidality. That's how suicidal
Yeah,
thoughts is what I'll call it, just for my own
sure.
pronunciation feelings. But hey, listen, man, Pete Hegseth is an alcoholic. There's a lot of depression and suicidal tendencies amongst alcoholics, and guess what? We made him the head of the Department of Defense. Like
Yeah.
it's this weird double standard for one side and not the other is insane, and I cannot believe there is an argument that this makes America safer.
No, and I also think one more thing, just putting things in context with there's, oh, these people are depressed, oh, these people have suicidal ideations. They're also in a world where they're being very, very explicitly, things are being made harder for them. They're being singled out. And the right likes to talk a lot about, oh, you think everybody's out to get you. There's no such thing as a systemic anything. Everybody just feels like they're being the victim. But at the same time, transgender people are being very, very explicitly singled out. Like, this is a
Yep.
law, this is an executive order that's being enacted. This is going to affect 1% of the military. And you look also at the trans athlete bans that Trump put executive orders in place for, and it is such a small number.
Yeah.
An ACLU spokesperson in 2023 told Newsweek that one of the main organizations pushing for trans athlete bans had only managed to identify 5 transgender athletes between kindergarten and 12th grade. K through 12, 5. Not 500, not 5,000, not 5 million, not what Matt Walsh might want to make you believe if you look on the Joe Rogan Experience.
Right.
5 people. And then if you look, one of the NCAA presidents said that he is only aware of fewer than 10 athletes at the college level that are transgender, or at least that were, I think it might have specifically been male to female transgender students participating as athletes. And that is insane. Like, yeah, can you imagine how suicidal you might feel, or how depressed you might feel, or how victimized you might feel when the president of the United States made an executive order that literally expects you and 4 other people? Like, that is insane.
Well,
And I think it's really... Go on.
well, no, I would love to let you finish. I apologize.
No problem. I do think it's very ironic that conservative talking heads always like to make fun of liberals by saying, oh, because y'all majored in gender studies, which I did not. But even if we did, like, they say, oh, you major in gender studies, but then ask, what is a woman? I know, not you. And it's like, hey, if you are conceding, if your whole conceit is that this is a group of people that are much more likely to have studied gender at an academic level, then maybe, quite possibly, they have a more nuanced and in-depth and academic perspective than you do, and they might be using words in a way that you're not familiar with. That is your shortcoming when you're acknowledging they have studied a thing you have not. And it's important to keep in mind that gender is a social construct, and that does not mean that something isn't real. I think that it's often said, oh, it's a social construct, it doesn't exist. That's not what that means. It just means that it was something that was created by society. Gender refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. This includes norms, behaviors, and roles associated with being a woman, man, boy, or girl, as well as relationships with each other. That's according to the World Health Organization, which admittedly, the Republican Party right now does not respect, as Trump has already signed executive orders to pull out of the World Health Organization. But I think it's important to note that Western culture does look at gender with a very limited framework, seeing it as a binary that is at once inextricably linked to biological sex, yet also, if you listen to these conservatives talk about it, also being a thing that's in danger of being erased by a man wearing a dress. But it's important to keep in mind that, like, even though it is not very common within the Western Eurocentric framework, different societies throughout history across the world have had notions of third as well as fourth and fifth genders. Third gender is a thing that is seen most often when you're looking at these, and it's not like it's a ubiquitous thing everywhere, but these are unrelated cultures throughout history that have all come to the conclusions that gender is not 2 things. Examples of that are Native Hawaiians and Tahitians, and I am not 100% sure how to pronounce this, but Mahu, which is an intermediate state known as gender liminality. There are also many indigenous North American traditions that recognize third and fourth gender people in a variety of ceremonial roles, as well as the category, which is a neologism that is a new word for a thing that has existed in the past, two-spirit people. Also, there are hijras in South Asia, which are assigned male at birth, but present feminine. Although outsiders might consider them trans, Indian society and most hijras themselves do not consider themselves to be male or female or transitioning, but to be a third thing specifically. Ultimately, these are things that exist throughout different cultures. It is definitionally a social construct.
I just think, the ultimate point that we're going to keep coming back to every episode we do, that, rather than the question we're trying to answer, is that these things cannot keep happening for the country to exist the way it wants to exist, or the way that it always has existed.
Yeah. Which I guess brings us to the question of the day. Sid, can they just do that?
Well, and this is the demoralizing aspect, because I think you actually have to view this episode in two parts. Can they prevent trans people from joining the military? Well, unfortunately, the Supreme Court has already said they can do that. But if they're going to actually follow the Constitution, they shouldn't be allowed to prevent trans people from continuing their careers within the military. So the reality is, according to all precedent, they can't do that.
But are they going to anyway?
I actually think this is the one that I've never thought this would be an answer before, but we don't know yet. I really think this is going to come into the courts, because I don't think there's a lot of military support for disrupting troops and troop life in this fashion. So I think they're going to try, but I think if the Supreme Court prevents them from firing trans people, I think the government's actually going to listen to them.
Well, fingers crossed. Yeah. Is there anything that we can do as citizens?
Absolutely. Actually writing your senators is very important in this situation. Now, it might not sound as important when it feels like the judges are going to decide this, but the reality is the government at any point is allowed to sort of take away their appeal, to basically that we're no longer appealing this case, and we're just going to let the lower court decision stand, which in this case supports trans people. So actually, it's never been more important to write to your senators, especially if you live in a red state, in order to get them the support they need. The other thing I would actually argue is you also had earlier, we quoted the National Center for Lesbian Rights and GLAAD Law, and I would argue if you have any money, donate to them, because they are taking this all the way that they, as far as they need to go, and they need money to go up against the U.S. government.
So with all that in mind, take us home, Sid.
I think when we do these episodes, it is an intellectual exercise, but a lot of times people ask me like, okay, but at the end of the day, why should we care? And I think it's simple. At the end of the day, an attack on any minority group for the sake of othering them is an attack on all of us. The government is not going to stop at demonizing trans people. So even if you're some sort of weirdo who doesn't have empathy for them, understand that you're next. We need to protect these people, because by protecting them, we are protecting ourselves.